The candlelight flickered low in the smoky air of a medieval tavern. You can almost hear it, the uneven clatter of carved sheep bones rolling across a wooden table, the murmur of voices heavy with ale, and the sighs of men who had already lost more than they could afford. In this dim corner of a world long gone, gambling wasn't a pastime for the elite. It was a small rebellion against monotony, a way to wrestle with fate in a time when fate itself ruled everything. It may seem strange to you now, but dice games in the Middle Ages were not just games. They were a cultural ritual, an echo of human longing for control over luck and chance. In an age when plague, famine, and war could erase a life overnight, rolling bones on a tavern table was a statement of survival. I am still here to risk something. The earliest medieval dice were not the perfect cubes you might imagine from modern board games. They were irregular, often whittled from the bones of sheep or oxen, sometimes ivory if the gambler was wealthy. Many were unevenly weighted, whether by accident or by intention. A dishonest craftsman might carve one side just a little thinner to make a particular number appear more often. The phrase loaded dice wasn't just metaphorical, it was a medieval reality. But why bones? Why not wood or stone? The answer lies deep in the symbolic texture of medieval life. Bones were thought to contain a remnant of vitality, a kind of spiritual residue. To carve dice from bone was to imbue the game with life and death itself. When you rolled them, you rolled the essence of the animal. Some even whispered that a man's fortune might improve if the dice came from an animal sacrificed under a full moon, an echo of pagan superstition that lingered quietly beneath the surface of Christian Europe. In most towns, dice games were played anywhere people gathered: taverns, inns, and even churchyards after Mass. Clergymen complained endlessly about it. In 1190, a church council in Paris condemned dice playing as sinful, equating it with theft and adultery. The logic was simple: a man who gambled risked more than his coins. He risked his soul, since gambling implied a belief in chance rather than divine order. But that didn't stop anyone. Soldiers rolled dice to pass the time between battles. Sailors played on the decks of ships while waiting for wind. Even monks, those symbols of self-denial, were occasionally caught with dice hidden in their robes. The Liber Gomorianus, a 12th century moral treatise, scolded abbots who gave themselves over to bones and laughter, a phrase that captures both the sin and the strange charm of the act. For the poor, gambling was sometimes the only form of hope. A laborer might wager his day's pay, a loaf of bread, or a pair of worn boots. The games were quick, simple throws of 2 or 3 dice. There were no elaborate rules, no boards, no tokens. Just the numbers, fate, and whatever was at stake. The most common game, known as hazard, would later evolve into the modern game of craps. Its name came from the Arabic al-za, meaning the dice, a relic of cultural exchange from the Crusades. The Crusades themselves carried dice across continents. European knights, restless in foreign camps, learned from Arab soldiers who tossed dice to pass the time. They brought the habit home, along with stories, silks, and new diseases. And with them came the moral panic. Royal edicts began to appear. In 1254, King Louis of France forbade dice games among his knights, declaring that no man who sought holiness should rely on chance. England followed suit. Edward III banned dice among soldiers, fearing that distracted troops would lose discipline. But these laws were as effective as trying to stop the wind. Men played in secret. Women too, though less openly. In small cottages and manorial kitchens, wives and servants played dice after the day's labor, using stones marked with suit for pips. The stakes were humble: a slice of cheese, a candle stub, or the right to skip morning chores. Sometimes the game led to quiet ruin. Parish records from 14th century England tell of men selling their cloaks to settle gambling debts. There is a record from 1377 of a London baker named William of Kent who lost his bread and house in bones. The note is brief and unsympathetic, written in a clerk's flat tone, but you can feel the weight of it. A man undone not by war or plague, but by a handful of carved bones. Yet, in a way, this was how medieval people engaged with the universe. Dice mirrored life: unpredictable, sometimes cruel, always uncertain. When you rolled, you surrendered to something beyond reason, and for a brief moment, that surrender was thrilling. It was an illusion of power within a powerless life. The church's disapproval never quite managed to extinguish the allure. Even kings played. Henry VIII, famously gluttonous in every form of indulgence, maintained several sets of ivory dice in his private collection. He lost hundreds of pounds at dice in a single evening, even wagering the golden chain around his neck. For the upper classes, gambling wasn't rebellion, it was performance, a demonstration of abundance, a way of saying, I have so much I can afford to lose. There were also gambling houses, precursors to modern casinos tucked away in the busier cities of Europe. In Paris, London, and Venice, dice tables were set up in taverns with official permissions, or at least the right bribes. The atmosphere was thick with smoke and tension. Men shouted, coins clinked, and somewhere, a lute played a slow, off-tune song. It was both alive and tired, desperate and celebratory. In these rooms, fortune and ruin changed hands in seconds. A single roll could erase a family's savings. A lucky streak could elevate a beggar to wealth. But there was something almost meditative about it too. The repetition, the anticipation, the simple act of waiting for the dice to settle. You can imagine it, the rhythmic clatter on the table, the pause before the reveal, the murmured prayers, the resigned sighs. It's almost soothing. The curious thing is that even the moralists couldn't resist using dice as a metaphor for faith. Preachers warned that the devil casts dice for souls, and that sin was a gamble one could never win. But others, more philosophical, saw in dice a reflection of divine mystery, the unpredictable order of God's world. One Benedictine scholar wrote that every number is a shadow of creation, suggesting that even a throw of dice might echo the structure of the cosmos. In his view, there was no such thing as chance, only patterns too complex for the human eye to see. Perhaps that's why dice endured for centuries, despite every ban, every sermon, every lost fortune, because they weren't just about winning or losing. They were about understanding the fragility of control itself. And, maybe, for the wary men and women of the Middle Ages, that small reminder that fate could be both cruel and kind was oddly comforting. By the late 15th century, dice had become so woven into daily life that even the new printing presses included illustrations of dice games. A German woodcut from 1496 shows a monk, a knight, and a peasant all hunched over a table throwing dice together. Their faces are calm, almost solemn. It looks less like gambling and more like prayer. There's a quiet beauty in that image. Three men from utterly different worlds united by a shared act of chance. Because in the end, that's what the game of bones was, not just a gamble, but a momentary equalizer. Rich or poor, holy or sinful, everyone was at the mercy of the same small cubes. Everyone waited for the same numbers. Everyone held their breath at the same sound. The clatter of fate across the table. But one must wonder, did they ever think of where those bones came from? The sheep, the oxen, the creatures carved into instruments of luck. Did they imagine the lives behind the materials they handled so carelessly? Perhaps, as the tavern lights dimmed and the last ale was poured, someone did. Someone might have looked down at the dice in his palm and thought. The sound of dice tumbling on wooden tables may have been a harmless comfort to some, but to the medieval authorities, both sacred and royal, it was the sound of decay. To them, dice meant chaos, a visible symbol of disobedience, greed, and the unsettling notion that fate could be influenced by mere chance. For the church, it was an assault on divine order. For the crown, it was a threat to discipline and productivity, and for centuries, both would struggle, often futilely, to bring the game of bones to heel. The church's uneasy dance with chance. In the eyes of medieval theologians, gambling wasn't just a vice, it was a spiritual infection. It eroded patience, bred dishonesty, and replaced prayer with luck. Yet, the problem wasn't simple. Medieval Christianity existed in a world where randomness, droughts, plagues, storms, the birth of a healthy child, shaped every aspect of life. To say that chance existed was almost to say that God didn't. This theological problem obsessed thinkers from Augustine onward. Saint Augustine himself wrote that, "Nothing is by fortune, but all things are ruled by providence." To gamble, therefore, was to deny God's direct hand in the world. Every toss of a die was, symbolically, a small act of rebellion, a human asserting control where only God should reign. By the 12th century, church councils were issuing formal prohibitions. The Decretum Gratiani, the great codification of canon law, forbade clerics from gambling, calling it a game unworthy of those vowed to prayer. But it was more than moral disapproval. Dice games were contagious. They spread laughter, noise, and distraction inside monasteries. There are records of friars in the 13th century being punished for rolling bones in the cloister after compline, meaning after evening prayers. Imagine that scene for a moment, the heavy silence of stone corridors, the echoing chants fading into night, and then, somewhere in the dark, the faint clack of dice against the floor. It must have sounded almost scandalous, like laughter in a graveyard. And moralists and their strange stories, sermons from the Middle Ages reveal how deeply dice infiltrated the moral imagination. One of the most famous tales came from the 13th century preacher Jacques de Vitry. He told of a gambler who lost everything in a dice game: his money, his clothes, and finally, in desperation, his soul. The devil, disguised as a rival player, collected his winnings immediately. Another story, circulated in English sermons, described Christ and the Virgin Mary walking past a tavern where men were gambling. One man, upon seeing them, swore that if he lost the next throw, he would stab the baby Jesus. He lost, and did. The story ends with a moral: the devil owns the dice, and those who roll them are playing in hell's company. These tales were absurd and terrifying, but they worked. They planted a seed of guilt deep in the minds of ordinary people. Yet, no amount of guilt could stop the boredom of winter nights, or the restlessness of idle hands, royal prohibitions and the problem of enforcement. If the church fought dice for souls, the crown fought it for order. In an age when soldiers, workers, and apprentices could vanish into taverns for hours, gambling was a distraction the authorities could not afford. One of the earliest royal edicts against gambling came from King Henry here of England in the late 12th century. Soldiers of his army were forbidden to play dice, except knights, and even they could only wager small sums. The punishment for breaking the rule was harsh loss of pay, or in some cases public whipping. But the rules rarely stuck. By the 14th century, every English monarch had renewed some version of the dice ban. Edward III in 1363 forbade commoners from playing any unlawful games, which included dice, cards newly imported from the East, and early forms of bowling. His reasoning was practical: men were spending more time gambling than practicing archery, a vital skill for England's armies. In 1388, Parliament doubled down. The Statute of Cambridge ordered that servants, apprentices, labourers, and artificers should spend their leisure hours practicing the longbow instead of cards, tables, or dice. The Crown's anxiety was simple: an untrained archer was a useless soldier, and dice were breeding idleness. But these laws met the same fate as all medieval regulations: they were ignored, forgotten, or quietly mocked. Records from London taverns show fines issued almost weekly to gamblers of bones, suggesting that authorities treated it more as a source of revenue than a moral issue. In practice, dice were unstoppable. Dice in the law courts, interestingly, the legal system itself sometimes mirrored the game of chance it condemned. In the earliest medieval courts, when evidence was lacking, judgment by ordeal was common, plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying hot iron to prove innocence. These acts of fate were, in essence, holy dice rolls. The outcome was left to divine will. In that sense, the church and the gamblers weren't as different as they claimed. Both believed in fate, both surrendered control, one to God, the other to luck. Perhaps that's why bans on gambling were so ineffective. They fought against something embedded in the medieval understanding of reality itself. By the 15th century, some judges began using dice imagery in their legal commentaries. The English jurist Fortescue compared justice to a game of hazard, wherein truth must ever throw the greater chance. The metaphor stuck. To gamble was immoral, but to acknowledge life as a gamble was natural. Gambling as a social thread despite prohibitions, gambling connected people across classes in ways few other activities did. In a society rigidly divided between nobles and peasants, the dice table was a rare equalizer. The son of a blacksmith might sit across from a minor nobleman, a monk might risk a few coins against a travelling merchant. The moment the dice rolled, all titles vanished. Taverns were the great crossroads of this world. Most were humble, single-room wooden halls with smoke-stained beams, the air thick with the smell of sweat and ale. Tables were sticky, benches uneven, and in one dim corner, a group might be rolling bones by candlelight. The sound carried through the room like a quiet drumbeat. For many, gambling was less about money and more about companionship. In towns where days were long and nights endless, dice gave people something to talk about, a reason to gather, to argue, to laugh. It was, in a strange way, a form of storytelling. Some players even developed rituals, tapping the table 3 times for luck, blowing on the dice before rolling, or whispering a prayer to Saint Matthias, the patron saint of chance, ironically chosen by Lot to replace Judas among the apostles. Dice and death. There was a darker side, of course. Gambling debts could destroy lives, especially among the poor. Chronicles from the late Middle Ages are full of small tragedies: men imprisoned for failing to pay wages, families losing homes, apprentices stealing from their masters to cover losses. The connection between dice and death became so well known that painters and poets used it as moral imagery. In The Triumph of Death, a 15th century fresco from Palermo, skeletons play dice among the corpses of nobles. a grim reminder that chance governs all, even the end of life. One English preacher wrote in 1412 that, "The dice playeth on the coffin of every man." It was meant as condemnation, but there's something almost poetic in it, a vision of mortality as a final throw of the bones. The paradox of luck. What fascinates historians today is how dice managed to exist at the very heart of a culture that despised them. Every attempt to erase them only made them more symbolic. They were painted in manuscripts, carved into church pews, even used as teaching tools in early mathematics. In Paris, around 1350, university students used dice to learn arithmetic and probability, not as gambling, but as practical number play. Yet, those same students would later be fined for gambling with the very objects they'd used for study. The contradiction is almost comical. This paradox reveals something deeper, that medieval people, despite their piety, were curious about randomness. They couldn't resist wondering whether luck had a logic. Long before probability theory, they noticed patterns. They believed certain numbers were lucky, 3 and 7 echoing biblical symbolism, while others, like 1, carried the danger of pride. When a gambler rolled a 7, he might murmur a short psalm. When he rolled a 1, he crossed himself. Even in sin, the sacred lingered. The dice in the cathedral, in one of the strangest ironies of all, dice found their way into sacred art. Medieval cathedrals, particularly in France and Italy, sometimes included carvings of soldiers or commoners casting dice beneath depictions of Christ's passion. This imagery came from the gospel story of the Roman soldiers who cast lots for his garment. To medieval minds, this wasn't just an anecdote. It was a warning. Even at the foot of the cross, men were gambling. Even in the presence of the divine, the dice rolled on. Some preachers used this image to argue that gambling was the ultimate symbol of human folly, men distracted by games while salvation hung above them. Yet, there's something almost tender in the image too, the recognition that even in the most sacred story, people remained human, frail, and restless. By the dawn of the Renaissance, dice had become a quiet fixture of daily life again. The bands still existed on paper, but they were like ghosts, relics of moral battles long lost. In taverns and drawing rooms alike, the dice continued to fall. They became smaller, neater, more symmetrical, carved not from animal bone but from ivory and polished wood. Still, the essence remained the same. Each throw was a question whispered into the dark. What will happen to me next? And though the church still frowned and kings still legislated, the people never stopped rolling. Perhaps they couldn't. Perhaps in a world so ruled by forces beyond their control, the dice offered the only moment where choice, however illusory, felt real. So the church preached against it, and the crown outlawed it, yet the sound of dice on tavern tables never truly faded. It echoed through the centuries, a small defiance, a quiet joy, and an acceptance of uncertainty. But how did this forbidden pastime evolve from taverns and monasteries into the grand gaming halls of Renaissance Europe, where nobles, courtiers, and kings rolled dice on velvet tables under golden chandeliers? By the late 15th century, the old game of bones had changed. The coarse taverns and soaked corners still rang with the familiar clatter of dice, but something new was stirring in the air. The Renaissance was arriving, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, and with it came new ways to imagine risk, fortune, and the fragile art of chance. The Middle Ages had seen dice as sin or symbol. The Renaissance would begin to see them as calculation. The old belief that chance was divine whim began to crack under the pressure of reason. Philosophers and mathematicians, peering at dice not with fear but fascination, started to suspect that there might be a hidden pattern behind luck, a rhythm beneath the randomness. And while they worked quietly in their studies, gamblers in brocade and velvet were discovering something else, that fortune could be staged, adorned, and made beautiful. Dice were about to become not merely games, but performances of wealth and intellect. Dice in the Renaissance courts. By the 1500s, gambling had become an accepted, even refined, pastime among Europe's nobility. The same kings who outlawed dice among peasants now held glittering gaming nights in their own palaces. In Venice, Milan, and Paris, the wealthy gathered in candlelit halls to play not just with coins, but with jewels, deeds, and inheritances. The dice were no longer crude bone carvings. They were polished ivory cubes, their pips inlaid with silver or mother of pearl. Some were carved with ornate initials or coats of arms. The sound they made was softer, more musical, not the raw clack of tavern dice, but a delicate click against polished tables. In the court of Francis I of France, gambling was a social art. Chroniclers described entire evenings devoted to dice and card games, punctuated by music and poetry. A losing player might compose a sonnet to his misfortune. A winning player might dedicate a verse to fortune herself, imagined as a capricious goddess turning her wheel. But even as the nobles played, the moral tension persisted. Gambling carried a whiff of the forbidden, the thrill of doing what the church still disapproved of, yet what society quietly adored. To gamble was to flirt with chaos, to show that one could handle risk with elegance. It was in a way an early form of performance psychology. Monarchs, fortune, and the theatre of risk, no one embodied this paradox more than Henry V. His gambling habits were legendary, not the desperate wagers of a tavern gambler, but the proud theatrics of a man who believed his luck reflected divine favour. Records from his royal household list entire pages of dice purchases: 2 pair of bone dice, 6 pair of ivory dice, 1 set of long dice for hazard. He gambled at tables lined with velvet and lit by golden candelabra, surrounded by courtiers eager to lose gracefully. The sums were enormous. He once lost 325 in a single night to fortune then, smiling as if it proved his nobility. For Henry, gambling wasn't vice, it was symbol. To win was to show divine blessing, to lose was to show magnanimity. Either way, he performed power, but not all kings managed it so gracefully. In the early 1500s, Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire issued an edict condemning gambling among soldiers, warning that it led to fights, murders, and ruin. Ironically, Maximilian himself was a passionate dice player, often wagering his own jewelry. One ambassador reported him losing a ring and then laughing, saying, "Fortune teaches humility better than any sermon." There was a strange honesty in that remark. For even the most powerful men, dice remained what they had always been: tiny, impartial judges of fate, the mathematics of luck. While kings rolled for amusement, scholars were rolling for understanding. In Italy around 1520, a mathematician named Girolamo Cardano began writing a book that would quietly change the history of chance. Cardano was not just a scholar, he was also a gambler, known to haunt taverns and gaming houses. But unlike most players, he took notes. He calculated the odds of throws, patterns of wins and losses, and the hidden symmetry of 6-sided dice. His treatise Liber de Ludo Elise, book on games of chance, written around 1564, was the first systematic attempt to describe probability. Cardano explained in plain terms that luck was not chaos but statistics. Every possible outcome could be counted, every risk measured. In a single stroke, he transformed dice from emblems of divine mystery into instruments of human knowledge. But Cardano was still a man of his age. He sprinkled his calculations with prayers, astrological charts, and meditations on fate. He could never quite let go of the idea that perhaps, after all the counting was done, fortune still had the final say. It was a perfect metaphor for the Renaissance mind, halfway between science and superstition, enlightenment and enchantment, gambling houses and the birth of public luck. As cities grew and trade expanded, gambling moved from private parlors into public houses. Venice led the way. By the mid-1500s, the city had established the world's first state-sanctioned casino, the Ridotto, where nobles and wealthy merchants gathered under official supervision. The Ridotto was both luxurious and controlled, an attempt to confine vice within elegance. There were strict dress codes, marble floors, and masked players whispering over gold and dice. The government took a share of the profits, of course, ensuring that the game served the state as much as the people. It was here, in rooms of candlelight and measured silence, that modern gambling culture was born. Dice were joined by cards, tables, and chips. Games acquired rules, etiquette, and social layers. Losing became almost fashionable, provided one did it gracefully. The Ridotto would become a model for gambling houses across Europe, and the idea of chance as entertainment, once condemned by both church and crown, became a cornerstone of urban leisure. From superstition to skill, the perception of gambling changed too. Where medieval peasants saw luck as divine will, Renaissance thinkers began to view it as a test of reason. A clever player could, they believed, manage risk through strategy. This shift echoed through art and literature. Renaissance paintings often depicted fortune as a woman with a wheel or blindfold, yet now she appeared less as a moral warning and more as a muse. Playful, unpredictable, but approachable. Writers like Baldassare Castiglione, in the Book of the Courtier, advised nobles to gamble moderately, not to win money, but to show composure and wit. The ideal courtier was one who could laugh at loss and make fortune seem irrelevant. The dice game had become a social mirror, reflecting grace, intellect, and poise. Dice in literature and art, even as they became refined, dice retained their moral ambiguity. Poets and painters loved them for what they represented: the fragile border between order and chaos. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, had already immortalized the dice, playing tavern rogues in The Pardoner's Tale. By the Renaissance, that image evolved. In Shakespeare's Henry V, soldiers rolled dice for their lives before battle, a symbol of fate's cruelty. In Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra mocks Antony for losing his world at hazard. Painters, too, found meaning in dice. Caravaggio's The Card Sharps and the cheats with dice captured the silent tension between trust and deceit, luck and manipulation. These were not medieval peasants anymore. They were courtiers in fine dress, gambling not for food but for vanity. Dice had climbed the social ladder, but they carried their shadow with them. The morality of fortune, even as gambling gained sophistication, the church never stopped warning against it. In 1563, the Council of Trent reaffirmed the sinfulness of games of chance, especially those involving money. Priests preached sermons comparing dice to weapons of the devil. Confession manuals listed gambling right beside adultery and usury. But in the same century, confessionals grew busier, not emptier. Players would lose at dice on Saturday night and kneel in repentance on Sunday morning, fully intending to roll again by Monday. The duality persisted. Luck was both sin and salvation, vice and virtue. The dice symbolized humanity's eternal struggle between control and surrender, and perhaps that's why they never truly disappeared. The quiet survival of the game of bones by the 17th century, the humble bone dice of medieval Europe, had given rise to countless descendants. Card games, lotteries, and the first mechanical gaming devices. Yet, in small villages and rural inns, the old form survived. Travelers' journals from the English countryside mention shepherds carving dice from sheep bones and playing hazard by the firelight, just as their ancestors had 300 years earlier. The same gestures, the same laughter, the same whispered hopes. There is something haunting about that continuity. The world around them was changing. The Reformation had torn through Europe. Telescopes were pointed at the stars, and merchants carried spices from across oceans. Yet, in the quiet corners of the night, men still rolled bones for luck. It was an unbroken thread of human habit to seek pattern in chaos, to tempt fate with a rattle and a throw. The birth of modern gambling, the transformation from medieval vice to modern entertainment, was complete by the 1600s. Gambling became not only tolerated but institutionalized. Kings taxed it, cities licensed it, and philosophers studied it. The very language of dice seeped into everyday speech. Hazard, chance, throw, luck. These words, once confined to taverns, became metaphors for politics, love, and war. Life itself was described as a game of dice. By the Enlightenment, probability theory would formalize what gamblers had always sensed intuitively. Pascal and Fermat, studying dice games, laid the groundwork for modern mathematics, for statistics, risk analysis, even insurance. It's astonishing, really, the intellectual machinery that powers finance, weather prediction, and artificial intelligence began with men rolling carved bones in medieval taverns. The meaning beneath the boredom, and yet, despite its glamour and consequence, the core of it remains quietly human. The dice game was never truly about money or mathematics. It was about the feeling, that moment of suspension between hope and consequence, when the bones are in the air and time seems to pause. For medieval players, that pause might have been the only space of freedom in lives otherwise ruled by toil, law, and divine decree. For Renaissance courtiers, it was a dance with fortune. For us, perhaps, it is a memory of how long humans have lived with uncertainty, and how often they've tried to make peace with it. Dice are small things, easily overlooked, yet they carry within them the entire architecture of chance, of risk, reward, and resignation. Each throw is a miniature universe, a quiet echo of the first act of creation, order drawn from chaos. And maybe that's why they endure. Because no matter how rational or advanced the world becomes, the old desire remains, to let go, if only for a moment, and let the universe decide. So the taverns faded, the bones grew smooth, and the players changed. But the sound, that soft, familiar clatter, still echoes through the ages. It is the sound of humanity playing with its own fate, again and again, in the flicker of candlelight. And somewhere, perhaps even now, a man turns a die in his palm and wonders, just as they did centuries ago. It is winter in medieval France, somewhere around the year 1425. The air is cold, the fields are bare, and the church bells ring across the frosted rooftops of the town. Inside the cathedral, candles flicker in their holders. The priests are singing their morning prayers, but something seems different. There is laughter echoing through the nave. At first, it's small, a few giggles from the choir stalls, but then it grows. A low murmur swells into full-bodied laughter, and suddenly a young cleric dressed in ragged vestments steps into the aisle wearing a bishop's hat made from paper. Around his neck hangs a chain of sausages. Behind him, another priest carries a censer filled not with incense, but with burning straw. Someone blows a trumpet fashioned from an ox's horn, wildly out of tune. The Feast of Fools has begun. For one day, sometimes two, sometimes even three, the rules of medieval society were suspended. The world turned upside down. The church, that pillar of order and discipline, became a theatre of absurdity. Servants mocked their masters, monks parodied bishops, and peasants strutted through the streets pretending to be lords. It was noisy, ridiculous, and in the eyes of church authorities, profoundly embarrassing. And yet, for centuries, it was one of the most anticipated events of the year. A holiday for chaos, the Feast of Fools took place between Christmas and Epiphany, usually on the first few days of January. A time of midwinter celebration when food was scarce, daylight short, and spirits in need of lifting. It was one of many festivals that blurred the line between sacred and profane, where laughter was permitted in the house of God. In some places, it was organized by the lower clergy, the choir boys, deacons, and parish assistants who spent most of the year in quiet servitude under their superiors. The feast gave them a sanctioned chance to let loose. They elected a fool bishop or bishop of misrule, a mock ruler chosen from among the lowest ranks. This mock bishop would lead processions, deliver fake sermons, and preside over a parody mass filled with jokes, animal noises, and sometimes outright blasphemy. Outside the church, the festivities spilled into the streets. People wore masks, played drums, and paraded effigies of authority figures. They sang bawdy songs, exchanged clothes, and performed little plays mocking kings, bishops, and merchants. In some towns, the cathedral choir boys would dress up as women or animals, dance in the aisles, and pelt spectators with ashes. It was chaos, sanctioned, expected chaos. To the people, it was joyful release. To the authorities, it was a nervous necessity. Medieval society was so rigid, so hierarchical, that without moments of inversion, without these safety valves of laughter, the system might collapse under its own weight. So, for a brief time each winter, the world was allowed to wobble. Inside the Cathedral of Fools, to truly imagine the feast, you have to picture a cathedral not as the solemn, echoing space we think of today, but as a living stage. The great Gothic arches reverberated not with hymns, but with clapping, stamping, and even animal sounds. A parody of the Mass might begin priests chanting in mock Latin, turning sacred verses into comic rhymes. Someone might read the Gospel backward, another might swing a chicken instead of a censer. Incense was replaced with smouldering shoe leather or piles of straw. The mock bishop would deliver sermons full of gibberish and puns, often poking fun at real clergymen or local gossip. Between the readings, the choir might break into popular songs, love ballads, drinking tunes, or even nonsense chants. Outside, bells rang wildly. Donkeys were led into the church, sometimes symbolizing the stubbornness of humanity, sometimes just for amusement. In one well-documented version of the celebration, known as the Fist of the Ass, the congregation would actually bray like donkeys at the end of each hymn. Hee-ha! Hee-ha! This mixture of piety and parody is almost impossible to imagine in modern terms. It wasn't blasphemy in the way we might think. It was exaggeration, theatrical mockery, and, oddly enough, devotion through absurdity, because after the laughter ended, the church returned to order. The bishop resumed his role. The choir boys resumed their obedience. The mock bishop laid down his paper crown, and the normal hierarchy reasserted itself, stronger perhaps for having been briefly overturned. A world built on hierarchy. To understand why such a strange festival existed, you have to understand the world it belonged to. Medieval Europe was a society obsessed with order. Every person, from king to peasant, had a divinely appointed place. To step outside that order was to risk both social punishment and spiritual peril. A peasant could not dress like a lord. A woman could not speak like a man in public. A child could not contradict his elder. The church reflected this order perfectly, the pope at the top, followed by bishops, priests, deacons, and finally, the lowly clerks and choir boys. But human beings, no matter how devout or disciplined, have limits. Centuries of rigid routine bred a longing for inversion, for one day of rebellion, laughter, and collective mischief. The Feast of Fools provided exactly that. It wasn't about disrespect. It was about balance. By turning the world upside down for a day, medieval people reaffirmed its structure for the rest of the year. When the fool wore the bishop's hat, everyone laughed. But everyone also remembered that it was temporary. It was a kind of social therapy. It echoes of pagan roots. The church claimed the feast as its own, But its origins were older, much older. Historians see clear connections between the Feast of Fools and ancient Roman festivals like Saturnalia, where slaves dined with masters, and the streets were filled with masks, music, and misrule. During Saturnalia, roles were reversed, gifts exchanged, and public order temporarily abandoned. Sound familiar? As Christianity spread across Europe, it absorbed many such traditions, reshaping them to fit the calendar of saints and holy days. The Feast of Fools, though cloaked in Christian imagery, was essentially a baptized Saturnalia, a lingering echo of pagan joy hidden beneath layers of theology. And in that sense, it reveals something profound about human nature, that no matter how devout or disciplined a society becomes, it cannot erase its need for play. Even monks and priests, after long seasons of fasting and penitence, craved laughter. The feast was their release valve, their reminder that life, though serious, could also be absurd. The church's dilemma not everyone approved. In fact, many of the highest church officials despised the feast. By the 13th century, bishops across Europe were issuing formal bans, calling the celebrations disgraceful, diabolical, and contrary to the dignity of the church. Pope Innocent III condemned them outright in 1207. Later councils repeated the warnings: no more mock masses, no more costumes, no more fools in the sanctuary. And yet, it continued. In some cathedrals, even after official bans, the Feast of Fools simply went underground. Records show secret celebrations held by clergy after hours, the laughter muffled behind heavy wooden doors. Parishioners sometimes joined, pretending ignorance the next morning. It was as if the church itself couldn't fully deny the necessity of laughter. One French bishop, torn between discipline and compassion, tried to regulate rather than prohibit the event. He allowed the feast to continue, but insisted that the mock bishop's paper mitre be no taller than 6 inches, and that all participants remain sober. The result: according to local records, no one obeyed either rule. The language of laughter in the Middle Ages carried layers of meaning we've mostly forgotten. It wasn't simply amusement, it was a way of expressing the tension between body and soul, earth and heaven. Theologians debated whether laughter was sinful. Some, like St. John Chrysostom, warned that Christ never laughed. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, cautiously admitted that moderate laughter could be virtuous, provided it refreshed the spirit without leading to vice. The Feast of Fools walked that line perfectly. It was laughter as theology, a temporary descent into folly to remind people of their humanity. If you imagine the scene, candles burning low, voices singing off key, the scent of straw and smoke filling the cathedral, it's almost dreamlike, a carnival of contradiction. For one day, sin became comedy. When the bells went quiet by the late 15th century, the church's patience was wearing thin. The world was changing, reformers were rising, literacy spreading, and discipline tightening. The Feast of Fools, with its unruly joy, began to feel outdated, even dangerous. In 1445, the University of Paris declared the festival an abuse unfit for the house of God. Cathedral chapters across France and England followed suit. The laughter faded from the great stone halls. The fools' mitres gathered dust. But the spirit of the feast didn't vanish. It simply moved outside the church walls. In the towns and villages, people continued to hold mock parades, costume plays, and comic coronations. These secular echoes evolved into what we now call carnivals and Mardi Gras. The church may have silenced the feast, but the people carried it forward. It's strange to think of a world so strict, so bound by faith and hierarchy, allowing itself one annual day of laughter and madness. And stranger still to realize how essential that madness was to keeping order the rest of the year. Perhaps that's why the memory of the Feast of Fools still lingers. Because deep down, we recognize ourselves in it. The need to play, to mock, to laugh at power, even for a moment, never disappears. Still, one question lingers: how did this noisy, rebellious festival, once tolerated, even blessed, transform into the grand public carnivals of the Renaissance, where fools became symbols of wisdom and laughter turned into art? By the early 16th century, Europe had begun to change. The grand cathedrals still stood, their bells ringing across the rooftops, but inside, laughter had grown faint. The Feast of Fools was now a memory, condemned by bishops, forgotten by some, fondly remembered by others. But human beings, as history often shows, are slow to surrender their joy. The spirit of misrule did not die within the cold walls of the church. It simply walked out the door, found new clothes, and took to the streets. In towns from Flanders to Florence, laughter and chaos were reborn as carnival. From sacred satire to public spectacle, the word carnival comes from the Latin carn veil, farewell to meat. It marked the final days of feasting before the long austerity of Lent. On the surface, it was a practical observance: eat the last of the meat, cheese, and eggs before fasting began. But beneath that, it was a continuation of the old medieval appetite for inversion, for turning the world upside down before the solemnity returned. In many ways, Carnival was the Feast of Fools reimagined. Where the older festival had been confined to the church, Carnival spilled freely into the streets. Processions of costumed townspeople wound through narrow alleys. Musicians played pipes and drums. The poor wore crowns, the rich masks. The social order was not abolished, merely hidden behind the anonymity of disguise. And with disguise came liberation. In Florence, masked balls filled the palaces of the Medici. In Venice, where Carnival became almost a way of life, the mask allowed one to move through society unrecognized. A beggar might flirt with a duchess. A merchant might mock a bishop. The anonymity of costume turned the city into a theatre, and unlike the Feast of Fools, which had been tolerated for one day, Carnival could stretch for weeks. And echoes of the old feast, even though the church had tried to suppress the Feast of Fools, its fingerprints were everywhere in these new celebrations. The Lord of Misrule, once elected in monasteries and cathedrals, reappeared in civic form, a mock king chosen to preside over parades and feasts. In England, records show that as late as the 16th century, royal courts themselves appointed a Lord of Misrule to oversee Christmas revels. Henry VII's court, usually so ceremonious, rang with laughter as actors and jesters performed in his hall. In France, the Abbé des Sots Abbey of Fools organized plays that mocked politicians and prelates. In Spain, the entremeses, short comic sketches performed between serious dramas, grew out of the same tradition of mockery and inversion. What had once been a semi-religious satire had become a civic art. The Feast of Fools had not been destroyed. It had evolved. Carnival and the art of disguise imagine the streets of 15th century Venice on the eve of Lent. The canals reflect hundreds of lanterns. The air smells of roasted almonds and wax candles. Masked figures drift across the bridges, some in silken robes, others in tattered costumes. The masks themselves were objects of fascination. The borta, a white mask with a jutting chin and blank expression, hid the wearer's identity completely. The moretta, a small black velvet oval held in place by biting a button, turned the face into a mute silhouette. Men and women alike wore them, blurring gender, status, and even speech. To wear a mask was to become no one, and therefore anyone. In a society obsessed with identity and hierarchy, this was intoxicating. A nobleman could walk unnoticed among beggars, a servant could mock her master, lovers could meet without fear of scandal. Carnival dissolved the social lines that ruled every other day of the year. And, as in the Feast of Fools, that temporary chaos served a purpose. By allowing the world to fall into disorder for a time, it made the return to order bearable. The philosophy of the fool: as Carnival grew, so too did the figure of the fool. No longer just a comic nuisance, the fool became a symbol of freedom, of truth, of the human need to laugh at power. Artists and writers began to take an interest in him. In 1509, the humanist scholar Erasmus published The Praise of Folly, a witty, ironic book in which the goddess Folly herself praises her own virtues. She mocks theologians, scholars, and kings, but gently, cleverly, in the way only a fool can. The book was banned in some places, adored in others. It captured the spirit of the Feast of Fools in literary form. Erasmus's Folly says, in essence, that without laughter, wisdom decays; without absurdity, faith becomes cruelty. It's a message that would have made sense to those medieval priests, laughing in their cathedrals centuries earlier. In paintings, too, the fool appeared everywhere, in the works of Hieronymus Bosch, Pieter Bruegel, and later in Shakespeare's plays. The court jester, the village idiot, the carnival clown, all carried echoes of the old mock bishop and his paper crown. They were reminders that truth often hides behind laughter. Misrule in the court, even in royal courts, places where dignity and ceremony ruled. The fool was tolerated, even cherished. Henry VII's jester, Will Sommers, was allowed to mock his king openly. He could say what no courtier dared, because his role was to be the one voice of honest absurdity. The same was true in France, where King Francis I kept several jesters at court, and even emperors of the Holy Roman Empire maintained official fools. They were not merely entertainers. They were safety valves, human reminders of humility. And so, while the Feast of Fools vanished from cathedrals, its spirit lived on beside the thrones of kings. The return of order Carnival was not without its critics. The Protestant Reformation, with its stern rejection of Catholic ceremony and excess, viewed such celebrations as dangerous. Martin Luther himself was not humorless. He enjoyed a joke, but he condemned what he saw as the moral looseness of the carnival season. City magistrates began to enforce curfews. In Geneva, Calvin's followers banned masks and dancing altogether. Even in Catholic cities, the authorities watched carnival with nervous eyes. Too much laughter could lead to rebellion. Indeed, some of Europe's early uprisings, like the Peasants' War in Germany, borrowed the imagery of misrule. The poor dressed as nobles, carried symbols of mock authority, and declared themselves kings of justice. What had once been parody became protest. The line between laughter and anger blurred. The Feast of Fools had been safe because it was contained within the church. Carnival, sprawling through city streets, was harder to control. A curious survival by the 17th century, carnival was firmly entrenched across Europe, but it looked different everywhere. In France, it merged with theatre. The Comédie Italienne and Commedia dell'arte turned the archetypes of fools, lovers and tricksters into art. In England, it inspired the rowdy Twelfth Night revels. In Spain, masked parades still wound through the streets of Seville and Madrid. Even in small villages, peasants continued to hold local, full feasts, though they might call them by other names. The Festum Stultorum, the Abbot of Own Reason, the Boy Bishop's Day. It was as though Europe couldn't quite let go of the pleasure of reversal, of pretending, for one night, that the beggar could be bishop and the fool could be wise. The hidden wisdom, if you had lived then, if you stood on a cobblestone street in late winter, hearing the sound of laughter and pipes, you might have thought it was just noise, but beneath that noise was a subtle philosophy. The medieval Feast of Fools, and later the Carnival, reminded people that no hierarchy, no power, no institution was permanent. The laughter said, "Today we mock you, tomorrow we obey you." But both are human acts. It's why the church, despite centuries of bans, never quite erased it. The laughter had a kind of holiness to it, a recognition that even faith must breathe. That is perhaps the strangest and most beautiful thing about these celebrations, that they allowed seriousness to survive by giving it a day off. The legacy of misrule, the Feast of Fools, may seem distant, a curiosity of medieval custom, but its descendants are everywhere. Mardi Gras in New Orleans, Carnival in Rio, Fasnacht in Switzerland, all trace their roots to that same impulse to invert, to play, to release. Even modern April Fool's Day carries a ghost of it, and the deeper message endures. Every time people dress up, mock authority, or laugh at power, they are echoing the laughter that once filled the cathedrals of medieval France. Perhaps that's why historians still write about it, not because of its blasphemy, but because of its humanity. The Feast of Fools had travelled a long way, from the echoing naves of cathedrals to the painted masks of Venice, from parody sermons to public theatre. Yet its essence remained the same, laughter as a tool of survival. But how exactly did this laughter, once tolerated as harmless, become a form of political speech? How did the jesters and carnival players of the Middle Ages transform into the satirists, playwrights, and thinkers who would shape the modern idea of humour itself? The laughter that once echoed under the stone arches of medieval cathedrals did not fade away. It simply changed shape. When the church silenced the Feast of Fools, the laughter took to the marketplaces, to the court stages, to the pages of plays and pamphlets. And in doing so, it transformed into something far more enduring: satire. What began as mockery wrapped in incense smoke became, over centuries, a language of truth disguised as folly. The fool finds his stage. The late Middle Ages and Renaissance were times of growing awareness, of curiosity, of doubt, of self-reflection. And in this new atmosphere, the fool, once just a character in festival parades, began to gain a voice. You could find him everywhere: in the court of kings, on the wooden stages of travelling actors, even in the printed pamphlets sold for a few coins in the town square. He wore his motley coat, jingling with bells, but behind the laughter, there was always a question. The same question that had lingered since the days of the Feast of Fools. Who truly is the wiser, the king or the fool? The Carnival gave him freedom, but the Renaissance gave him meaning. Shakespeare's fools, perhaps the best known heirs of this medieval tradition, were the fools of William Shakespeare. When audiences in Elizabethan England watched King Lear, they saw a king lose everything: his power, his sanity, his family. And yet, the only person who dared speak truth to him was his fool. The fool in Lear mocks his master, but every jest cuts close to truth. When Lear rages and weeps, the fool stays by his side, whispering riddles that reveal what the courtiers cannot say aloud. "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise," he tells Lear. and the theatre falls silent. It is the same paradox that once animated the Feast of Fools. The lowest ranked speaks the highest truth. In Twelfth Night, the Jester Fest puts it even more clearly. Better a witty fool than a foolish wit. Through Fest, the audience learns that wisdom often hides in laughter, and that those who claim to be wise are often the most foolish of all. Shakespeare's fools were not clowns for amusement, they were philosophers in disguise. Their roots stretched back to the laughter that had once filled the cathedrals of Europe. The jester's privilege in the real courts of Europe, fools still played an important role. They were both entertainers and truth-tellers, the only ones who could mock a ruler without fear of punishment. In a world of rigid hierarchy, this was no small thing. When no one else could question the king, the fool could, because his words were shielded by laughter. A jest was a safer form of criticism than a speech. In Tudor England, Henry V's fool, Will Somers, was known for his gentle wit and honesty. He could call the king fat, or mock his endless marriages, and live to see another day. Somers even outlived the king, serving his children after his death. Elsewhere, fools performed a similar duty. In Russia, the Skomoroki, wandering jesters and musicians, sang songs that criticized local nobles. In Spain, the buffoons danced and joked in the courts of Castile, and in France, the fools of the king became fixtures at banquets. They all embodied a simple truth. Humor is a weapon so disarming that even power bends before it. From mockery to satire, as printing spread through Europe, the fool's voice found a new medium, the pamphlet. Writers like François Rabelais, the French humanist, filled their books with comic exaggerations and grotesque humor. His famous work, Gargantua and Pantagruel, written in the early 1500s, is a sprawling tale of giants who eat, drink, and laugh their way through a parody of medieval learning. Beneath the absurdity lies sharp criticism of the church, of scholars, and of hypocrisy itself. Rabelais's laughter was not just for amusement, it was an act of intellectual rebellion. It was, in spirit, the Feast of Fools reborn on paper. Rabelais even wrote of the laughter of the belly, saying that laughter was a sign of vitality, of being alive and human. To laugh was to resist death, ignorance, and despair. In that sense, his books were sermons, but of joy, not judgment. Erasmus and the return of folly. Decades before Rabelais, Erasmus of Rotterdam had already given folly her own pulpit. In the praise of folly, he imagined her standing before humanity, boasting of her powers. She says she governs the world, that every man and woman is ruled by vanity, pride, and foolish hope. It sounds like mockery, but there's tenderness in it too. Erasmus understood what medieval clergy, laughing at their own absurdity, had once known, that folly and wisdom are not opposites. They depend on one another. Without folly, there can be no humility. Without laughter, no understanding of limits. The Feast of Fools had shown this truth with parades and paper crowns. Erasmus showed it with words. Both reminded people that laughter, even foolish laughter, was part of being human. The dangerous side of laughter, like fire, can warm or destroy. As the centuries advanced, humor that once released tension began to turn against authority in more direct ways. By the 17th and 18th centuries, satire became political. In England, writers like Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope used wit to expose corruption. Swift's A Modest Proposal, which suggested that the Irish poor could sell their children as food, was a grotesque joke, but one that revealed the cruelty of British policy. The laughter it provoked was not merry. It was bitter, sharp, and uncomfortable. Once again, the fool was speaking truth, but this time to an audience much larger than a medieval congregation. The Feast of Fools had evolved from ritual parody to social critique. The carnival lives on. Even as satire grew in print, the old spirit of carnival continued in the streets. In Catholic Europe, especially in Italy, France, and Spain, pre-Lenten festivals persisted with color and song. In Venice, masked figures still wandered through the piazzas, laughing behind painted faces. In the Caribbean and Latin America, where European customs mingled with African and indigenous traditions, carnival took on new rhythms, drums, dances, and parades that turned misrule into celebration. The laughter survived every attempt to suppress it, from papal bans to Puritan sermons, because it filled a human need older than doctrine or discipline. It was a reminder that life is both serious and absurd. And so, when you see modern carnival, the glitter, the costumes, the noise, you are seeing not only a party, but an echo of that medieval laughter that once startled the priests in their pews. The fool's reflection, the fool's role, from the cathedrals of the 13th century to the stages of the Renaissance, has always been strangely moral. By pretending to be foolish, he reveals wisdom. By mocking sacred order, he restores its meaning. He is a mirror, one that distorts just enough for people to see their true shapes. When peasants played kings for a day, when clerks wore the bishop's mitre, when the choir brayed like donkeys, it wasn't just mockery, it was reflection. A way for a society built on strict obedience to laugh at itself without breaking apart. That may be why the Feast of Fools, though forbidden, never really vanished. Every age finds its own way to laugh at its solemnities. The medieval priest with a paper crown, the Renaissance jester at a king's side, the modern comedian with a microphone. They are all part of the same lineage. The last echo in the cathedral. It's difficult to say when the very last Feast of Fools was celebrated in a church. Perhaps it was sometime in the 16th century, when the Reformation swept through Europe and the Church of Rome tightened its discipline. Or perhaps it happened quietly, long after the official bans, in some small French cathedral, a few priests gathering after midnight, laughing softly as one of them put on a paper mitre and pretended to bless his companions. One can imagine the candlelight flickering on their faces, the air cold, the laughter gentle rather than wild. A final echo of an ancient tradition. Not blasphemy, not rebellion, but a recognition of human frailty. Even in its death, the Feast of Fools remained a kind of prayer. What Laughter leaves behind, if you think about it. History often remembers its kings and wars, its doctrines and decrees, but it forgets its laughter. And yet, laughter tells us just as much about who we were. The Feast of Fools reveals that the people of the Middle Ages, so often imagined as grim and superstitious, were capable of profound humor. They laughed at themselves, at their precepts, at the absurdities of their own faith, and somehow that laughter did not destroy their belief, it strengthened it. Because to laugh at something is not to hate it, it is to know it deeply enough to play with it. The wisdom that endures today. We live in a world filled with noise, where mockery often wounds instead of heals, but in the quiet rhythm of the old Feast of Fools, there is a gentler kind of laughter, one that humbles rather than humiliates, one that reminds people of their smallness and their shared absurdity. It is the laughter of the fool standing in a cathedral, swinging his mock censer filled with straw, knowing that tomorrow he will be a servant again, and yet tonight, just for this brief, blessed moment, the world belongs to him. That is not blasphemy, it is balance. And so the Feast of Fools, though long gone, continues to whisper to us, laugh, for the world is foolish, and you are part of it. From the sacred parody of medieval priests to the glittering chaos of modern carnival, the history of laughter is a history of freedom. The freedom to question, to imagine and to endure. Because sometimes, to survive the weight of the world, people must become fools for a day. Long before dogs wore jeweled collars and cats ruled the internet, medieval people were already obsessed with their animals, though in very different, and sometimes very strange ways. The idea of a pet as we know it didn't really exist. Animals were mostly for work, dogs hunted or guarded, cats caught mice, birds were trained to hunt, and horses carried knights into battle. But even in the midst of plagues, crusades, and castle sieges, people still found comfort in their creatures. They talked to them, they dressed them up, they even took them to church, and occasionally they gave them funerals. The faithful hound, if there was one animal that earned the medieval heart, it was the dog. Dogs appear everywhere in medieval art, lying at the feet of knights, trotting beside noblewomen, and curling up on the floors of monasteries. They were not just helpers, they were companions. In illuminated manuscripts, you'll often find tiny dogs drawn in the margins, white and fluffy, with solemn little eyes. They peek out from under the hems of dresses, or sleep near their mistresses' shoes. Some even appear in royal portraits. King Charles V of France had a beloved greyhound named Hector, who followed him everywhere. Queen Elizabeth I, a few centuries later, was said to keep small lapdogs that slept in her bedchamber, though her courtiers complained of the fleas. For hunting nobles, dogs were both status symbols and partners. A well-trained hound could track a stag or boar for miles through dense forest. But there were also humble dogs, mongrels kept by peasants to guard the home or help with herding. Some monasteries allowed dogs too, though only quiet and disciplined ones, according to monastic rules. You can imagine the monks walking to prayer at dawn, their sandals scuffing on the stone floor, followed by a sleepy brown dog wagging its tail. The cat saint or sinner. The medieval cat had a far more complicated reputation. On one hand, cats were useful. They kept the granaries and kitchens free of mice, which was no small service in an age before sealed jars and refrigeration. Many monasteries quietly tolerated cats for this reason. One Irish monk even wrote a short poem to his white cat Panga Ben around the 9th century. "I and Panga Ben, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at, hunting mice is his delight. Hunting words I sit all night." It's one of the earliest pieces of writing that sounds truly human, a moment of quiet companionship across time. But not everyone loved cats. During periods of superstition, especially in the later Middle Ages, cats, especially black ones, became associated with witchcraft. People believed witches kept them as familiars, spiritual helpers that gave them magical powers. In some towns, cats were even burned in bonfires on festival days to purify the city. Thankfully, this cruel custom died out by the Renaissance. Still, for every frightened superstition, there was also affection. Aristocrats and scholars alike kept cats for company. Cardinal Richelieu, centuries later, would famously keep a dozen cats in his study, all with names and personalities. It seems that even in medieval times, cats had already perfected their ability to sit on the most important book on your desk and refuse to move. Feathered friends and talking parrots, birds were among the most exotic pets of the medieval world. Crusaders returning from the east brought home parrots, falcons, and even peacocks. Parrots, with their bright feathers and ability to mimic speech, became status symbols among the wealthy. There's a record from the 13th century of an English noblewoman who owned a green parrot that could greet guests in French. So we can only imagine the chaos that caused at dinner. But meanwhile, falconry, the training of birds of prey for hunting, became one of the defining pastimes of the upper classes. There were entire manuals written on how to care for hawks and falcons. A good falcon was worth more than a horse. It needed constant attention, careful feeding, and daily exercise. Kings often gave falcons as diplomatic gifts, and losing one was considered a grave insult. Yet even among all the pageantry, many falconers developed genuine bonds with their birds. Some even wrote poems to their hawks, praising their grace and intelligence. To train a falcon was not only sport, it was a kind of partnership, built on trust and mutual respect. Monkeys and other marvels, the strangest pets of all were the monkeys. Imported from Africa, India, or the Middle East, they were rare and expensive. Only the very rich could afford them, nobles, bishops, or merchants with connections to foreign traders. Monkeys appeared in art as symbols of mischief and vanity. They were often shown stealing food, mimicking humans, or getting into trouble. But that's exactly what people loved about them. Owning a monkey was like owning a tiny reflection of yourself, clever, naughty, and unpredictable. Chroniclers tell stories of monkeys that learned to pour wine, ring bells, or play with dogs. One royal court reportedly kept a chained monkey in the Great Hall to amuse guests. It once escaped, stole the bishop's hat, and ran along the rafters shrieking with laughter. For people who lived in a world full of ceremony and obedience, the chaos of a monkey was irresistibly funny. It's no coincidence that in many paintings, monkeys appear beside jesters or fools, both creatures allowed to break the rules. A monastic menagerie, not all medieval pets lived in castles. In monasteries and convents, a quiet kind of affection for animals flourished. Many religious orders kept cats and dogs, but also doves, rabbits, and even pet squirrels. A 14th century record from a convent in Flanders mentions a nun who was reprimanded for feeding her pet raven too generously. Another entry from an English abbey complains about a brother who trained a ferret to fetch his slippers. Yet others saw animals as symbols of divine wisdom. Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century famously preached to birds and called all creatures his brothers and sisters. His sermons to sparrows and wolves inspired art and legend for centuries. And so, even in the most solemn places, life chirped and purred and wagged its tail. Animals in the margins. If you ever look at the margins of medieval manuscripts, those glowing pages painted with gold and strange beasts, you'll find a hidden world of humor. There are cats playing harps, dogs chasing bishops, and rabbits jesting on snails. Why? Because the monks who copied those books spent long, lonely hours hunched over parchment. They needed something to laugh at, so they drew their pets, their jokes, and their daydreams in the corners of sacred text. Some of these little doodles show a deep fondness for animals, a glimpse of ordinary life behind the veil of religion. The medieval world may seem cold and distant, but in those drawings, you can still feel warmth. A cat curled in ink beside a psalm, a dog sketched beside the word fideless, faithful. Funerals for pets in rare cases. Beloved animals were even buried with ceremony. Archaeologists have found small graves near medieval estates, dogs wrapped in cloth, sometimes with a collar or a small bell. There are even records of nobles commissioning epitaphs for their pets. One French knight wrote an entire poem mourning his greyhound, saying that, "No man ever had a truer friend. Even ordinary people sometimes bless their animals before travel or war." The church disapproved of giving animals Christian burials, but many ignored the rule. Because when you spend years with a creature that watches you, waits for you, and trusts you without question, rules begin to matter less. The quiet companionship. If you walked through a medieval village at dusk, you might have seen it a peasant woman milking a goat, while her dog waited patiently. A monk writing by candlelight, a cat curled in his lap. A knight polishing his armor while his falcon slept nearby. In those small, wordless moments, something human was being preserved. The need for companionship, for love that doesn't speak, for the company of another living soul. And those centuries have passed. That bond hasn't changed at all. We still talk to our pets, complain to them, laugh with them. We still treat them like family. The medieval world may have been full of superstition and cruelty, but also tenderness, small kindnesses that history rarely records. The next time you see your cat watching you from the corner of the room, or your dog waiting at the door, imagine their medieval ancestors, the monastery cats, the royal hounds, the mischievous monkeys. They too once listened to human voices by candlelight, and maybe, just maybe, they understood more than we think. When we think of the Middle Ages, we imagine muddy streets, wooden carts, and fields of grain. But behind the high stone walls of palaces and abbeys, another world quietly existed, one filled with animals so strange and magnificent that most people believed they came from heaven or hell. For nobles and scholars, collecting exotic creatures was not just a pastime, it was a way to prove power, piety, and curiosity. To own a lion was to show strength, to keep a peacock was to show divine beauty, and to display a polar bear, yes, a real one, was to show that even the ends of the earth could be tamed. The royal beasts of London. Let's begin in England. In the early 13th century, the Tower of London wasn't just a fortress, it was a zoo. Henry III, who reigned from 1216 to 1272, received an extraordinary gift from the King of Norway, a white bear, likely a polar bear. It caused a sensation. The bear was chained by the river, but allowed to swim in the Thames to catch fish, a sight that astonished the people of London. Soon, other rulers began sending animals as diplomatic gifts. Henry received lions from Emperor Frederick II, and an elephant from Louis IX of France. The elephant, sadly, lived only a few years. England's climate and diet were cruel to such a creature, but its arrival made a deep impression. Chroniclers described it as a grey beast of monstrous size, with teeth like swords. The Tower of London's menagerie grew over the centuries: lions, leopards, lynxes, even a hyena. It remained there until the 19th century, when the animals were finally moved to the newly built London Zoo in Regent's Park. But it all began as a medieval curiosity. Kings collecting living wonders from distant lands. The elephant of Frederick II across the Channel, Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, was perhaps the greatest animal lover of the medieval world. He kept menageries in Sicily and southern Italy, filled with creatures brought by merchants and crusaders: lions from North Africa, camels from Arabia, parrots from India, and cheetahs used for hunting. Frederick's court was a crossroads of cultures. Arabic scholars, Jewish physicians, and Christian monks all exchanged knowledge there, and among his strangest hobbies was falconry. He loved it so much that he wrote an entire book, De Art Venandi cum Avibus, on the art of hunting with birds, one of the most detailed zoological texts of the Middle Ages. It wasn't just about hunting, it was about understanding. Frederick carefully observed how birds of prey learned, how they mated, and how they could be trained. In an age of superstition, his method was scientific. He was also fascinated by elephants, not just as symbols of power, but as intelligent beings. His court was home to at least one elephant, whose arrival caused such wonder that poets compared it to the Leviathan of the Bible. For Frederick, animals were not just toys of empire, they were windows into God's creation. The peacock and the porcupine. If the lion was the king's beast, then the peacock was the queen's. No medieval banquet was complete without peacocks strutting through the hall, their feathers spread like living jewels. Sometimes, cooks would roast them, then carefully sew their feathers back on for display, a dazzling, if slightly grotesque, centerpiece. In art and literature, the peacock symbolized immortality. People believed its flesh did not decay, a charming myth that encouraged more admiration than accuracy. But beyond the royal tables, exotic birds were a sign of refinement. Falcons, parrots, cranes, and doves all appear in the inventories of noble estates. The rarer, the better. One French duke proudly kept a porcupine, an animal so strange that peasants thought it was a magical hedgehog that could shoot its quills like arrows. When the porcupine was shown at fairs, crowds gathered to see it roll into a ball. These small curiosities fed the medieval imagination, proof that the world was wider and weirder than anyone could fully grasp. Creatures of pilgrimage and trade, the Crusades opened Europe to new lands and new animals. Pilgrims returning from the Holy Land brought stories of camels, crocodiles, and elephants. A few wealthy ones brought back actual animals, though few survived the journey. Camels in particular fascinated Europeans. They were sometimes used in parades and royal processions to symbolize the East, though most people had no idea how to care for them. In France, there are records of camel keepers, employed by noble households, but no one quite knew what to feed them. One chronicler confessed that a camel given to the king, little, spat often, and died in displeasure, yet the trade in animals continued. Merchants from Genoa, Venice, and Marseille made fortunes importing exotic beasts for courts and menageries. They brought monkeys from North Africa, parrots from the Canary Islands, and even leopards from Ethiopia. To the average villager, these creatures were the stuff of legend, proof that the world beyond their fields held endless wonders. The mythical and the real, not every animal that filled the medieval imagination was real. Bestiaries, the illustrated animal encyclopedias of the time, mixed observation with myth. A lion might be shown breathing life into its cubs, symbolizing Christ. A pelican was said to pierce its breast to feed its young with blood, a sign of divine sacrifice. And the unicorn, was described as a fierce, solitary creature that could only be tamed by a virgin. To medieval readers, these animals weren't fables. They were moral lessons disguised in fur and feathers. And when real exotic creatures began arriving from foreign lands, they were quickly folded into these myths. A rhinoceros might be called a unicorn of the Indies. A crocodile might be mistaken for a dragon. When reality met imagination, the result was pure medieval wonder. The monks and their miniature Zeus in quieter corners of the world. Monks also kept animals, though for different reasons than kings. Some monasteries maintained small menageries for study or as symbols of the harmony between creation and faith. There are records from Cluny Abbey in France of monks raising doves, peacocks, and tame deer. Others kept songbirds in cages near the cloister gardens, their melodies mingling with chants from the chapel. In the 12th century, one English abbey was said to have kept a small bear, a gentle creature that loved honey and wandered the orchard. More commonly, monks cared for injured animals, wolves, owls, and even hedgehogs. They saw compassion for creatures as a form of prayer. The Physiologus, an early Christian text on animals, taught that every beast contained a hidden meaning, a reflection of the divine order. To care for them was to honor the Creator. And so, in the silence of monastic life, among herbs and bells, a quiet form of zoology flourished, rooted not in spectacle but in reverence. The animal diplomats, by the late Middle Ages, animal gifts had become a form of diplomacy. When a king wanted to impress a rival, he didn't send gold, he sent something alive. In 1486, the Sultan of Egypt sent a giraffe to Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, the first giraffe seen in Europe since Roman times. Crowds gathered to watch it walk through the streets, its long neck bobbing above the rooftops. Lorenzo was so proud of it that he built a special enclosure just for his camelopard. In Portugal, King Manuel I kept elephants and leopards, gifts from India and Africa. He sent one of the elephants, named Hanno, to Pope Leo X in Rome. The Pope adored it. Hanno was paraded through the city, fed sweets, and even blessed in a ceremony. When it died 2 years later, the Pope mourned it deeply. An elephant had become, briefly, the darling of Christendom. These gifts carried more than novelty, they carried political weight. A lion or giraffe said, "Our trade routes are vast, our friendships global, our power divine." Lessons from the menagerie. Medieval menageries were strange, often tragic places, but they taught something lasting. They reminded people that the world was immense, filled with creatures unlike anything they knew. They inspired curiosity, art, and even early science. From these royal collections and monastic shelters grew the seeds of modern zoology. Frederick's falconry studies were later cited by naturalists. Monastic notes on bird migration and hibernation informed early biology. Even the Tower of London's Grim Zoo would evolve into the first public zoological gardens centuries later, where, ideally, animals were studied rather than caged for amusement. And so from the half-forgotten roar of a lion beneath a castle wall came a quiet realization that to understand animals was, perhaps, to understand ourselves. The medieval fascination with beasts, whether sacred, strange, or silly, reveals a deep truth about that era. People longed to see beyond the limits of their world, and yet, as these creatures dazzled Europe, another kind of animal amusement was spreading, one not of wonder, but of cruelty. What happened when people grew bored of admiring their animals and began using them for entertainment instead? There was another side to the medieval fascination with animals, one far removed from the monk's quiet kindness or the noble's jeweled parrots. It was the world of animal entertainment, where creatures were forced to fight, race, or perform for human amusement. In the medieval mind, this wasn't unusual. Life itself was a struggle for survival. War, hunger, and punishment were part of daily life, and so were the sights and sounds of animals locked in battle. And though today such practices seem cruel beyond imagination, they once drew laughter, cheers, and even royal applause. The origins of blood sport in the early Middle Ages, peasants and lords alike found sport in what they called the games of beasts. Dogs were set against each other in contests of strength and courage. Boars and bears were baited in pits, goaded by barking hounds. Even bulls were brought into arenas to be tormented for the crowd's delight. These spectacles weren't mere cruelty for its own sake. They were displays of power, bravery, and control over nature. A nobleman who owned fierce hunting dogs was seen as strong a town that could bait. A bear in its square was considered proud and free. The bear, in particular, was a symbol of the wild, dangerous, unpredictable, and deeply respected. To face it was to prove your courage. The bear gardens in England. Bear baiting became so popular that entire arenas were built for it. By the 13th century, London's bear gardens on the south bank of the Thames were as famous as its churches. Crowds gathered in the open air to watch dogs attack chained bears or bulls. Musicians played drums and trumpets, vendors sold food and ale. The noise was deafening, barking, roaring, shouting. Some spectators placed bets. Others simply came to escape the monotony of daily life. Even monarchs attended. Henry VI loved the sport and kept bears at court. Queen Elizabeth I had her own Bearwood-esque keeper of bears and watched the fights from a royal balcony. Chroniclers wrote of one performance where a blind bear fought 3 mastiffs and still stood victorious. The crowd cheered, not for mercy but for spectacle. To them, the bear's endurance was proof of divine order even in pain. The natural world was fierce and noble. Bull, baiting and public pride. Bull baiting was another favorite. In many towns, it became a civic ritual. The idea was simple. A bull would be chained to a post while dogs tried to seize it by the nose. It sounds horrific now, but to medieval minds, it served a purpose. They believed that, baited, meat was more tender and healthier to eat afterward. Some towns, like Stamford and Tutbury, held annual bull baiting festivals for centuries. Whole communities participated. Children climbed onto barrels to watch, musicians played, and taverns overflowed. It was not only entertainment, it was identity. To ban the game, locals argued, was to rob them of their traditions. And so it continued, long after the medieval age ended, into the 18th and even early 19th centuries. Cockfighting. The aristocrats' amusement. If bears and bulls were for the crowds, cockfighting was for the refined. It may seem odd, but in medieval Europe, cockfighting was considered an intellectual sport, a test of breeding and instinct. Noblemen raised roosters with the same care they gave to horses or hawks. Each bird had a name, pedigree, and reputation. Matches took place in taverns, castles, and even schools. A 14th century chronicler mentions that English schoolboys were given a day off each year to hold their own cockfights. With teachers supervising, bets were placed. Spectators debated strategy. Some birds even wore tiny metal spurs on their legs to make the fights more dramatic. In the eyes of the medieval gentleman, this was not savagery, but sport. Controlled, precise, and full of pageantry. Horse racing and hunting, of course. Not all animal games were violent. Horse racing and falconry offered spectacle without bloodshed. Racing horses had long been a pastime of the rich, a way to display wealth, breed quality, and command admiration. Knights compared steeds as they did armor, boasting of speed and stamina. In tournaments, horses became extensions of their rider's honor. A knight's victory was shared with his mount, which was often richly fed, brushed, and even blessed. Hunting, meanwhile, was considered both sport and duty. Kings hunted not only for food, but to demonstrate their divine right to rule the land and its creatures. The forest, in medieval law, was sacred, belonging to the crown. To poach within it was treason. But for nobles, to chase a stag through those forests was pure joy, a dance of endurance and skill. Even here, though, the balance between admiration and cruelty was thin. Hunts were elaborate, exhausting affairs, often ending with the ceremonial killing of the animal in front of the court. To the medieval eye, this was not cruelty but reverence, honoring the beast's strength by meeting it in fair chase. A boar hunts in the code of valor. No medieval hunter was truly tested until he faced the wild boar. Boars were ferocious, cunning, and fast. They could gore a horse or man with a single charge. Their tusks gleamed like ivory knives. Hunting them was considered the ultimate act of bravery. A good boar spear had a crosspiece below the blade, to stop the animal from running up the shaft and mauling the hunter. Even kings risked their lives in these hunts. In 1100, King William II of England, known as William Rufus, was famously killed in a hunting accident. Whether by misfortune or assassination, it showed how dangerous the sport could be. But it was also deeply symbolic. To kill the wild boar was to conquer chaos itself, to prove one's worth before God and man. And entertaining the village while nobles hunted stags and boars, common folk found amusement in simpler games. Village fairs often included animal competitions, dancing bears led by traveling performers, dogs that walked on hind legs, geese races, and even pig-catching contests, where participants chased greased pigs around the square. The laughter was genuine. In a life filled with toil, such moments were precious. Some wandering entertainers trained their animals to perform tricks. Monkeys dressed as knights, dogs that played dead, or trained birds that could mimic prayers. These were not cruel, only odd, small glimpses of joy in dusty streets. Children followed the performers from town to town, and adults tossed coins to watch a dog jump through a hoop. It was humble entertainment, far removed from royal menageries, yet somehow more human. The moral awakening over the centuries, attitudes began to shift. By the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, thinkers like Erasmus and Thomas More began to question the morality of cruelty for amusement. Religious reformers preached compassion toward all living creatures. Saint Francis of Assisi's teachings, that animals were our brothers and sisters, gained influence, but change was slow. Bear baiting continued in England until the 1600s, and cockfighting until the 1800s. Cruelty took centuries to fade from custom. Yet, in the art and writing of the later Middle Ages, you begin to see something new: affection. Paintings of dogs curled at their masters' feet, poems mourning lost falcons, and stories that spoke of loyalty and companionship. The medieval world, for all its harshness, had begun to feel tenderness again. Between blood and love, the medieval relationship with animals was full of contradictions. People adored their pets, painted them in manuscripts, and kept them as symbols of virtue. But they also chained, baited, and bled them for laughter. It's difficult to reconcile affection and brutality living side by side. Perhaps it reflects the age itself, a time when life was short, uncertain, and filled with suffering. When death was a public event, and survival a daily struggle. To control a beast, even to torment it, was, in a way, to master one's own fears, and to love it was to remember that something gentle still existed in the world. The medieval person lived close to animals. They were food transport workers, protectors, and friends. Every part of life, from prayer to play, was shared with them. The legacy of medieval animal life, from the monks' gentle cats to the king's roaring lions. The story of medieval animals mirrors the story of humanity itself. Curiosity mixed with cruelty, love tangled with ignorance. Those who trained their falcons helped create the first manuals of zoology. Those who kept exotic beasts laid the foundation for scientific classification. And even those who cheered in the bear pits left behind an uncomfortable question. What does it mean to find joy and power over another living thing? It's a question that echoes into modern times. From circuses to zoos, from hunting lodges to city apartments filled with pampered pets. The medieval world may seem distant, but its relationship with animals shaped the one we live in now. The one where you might fall asleep beside a purring cat, or wake to a dog's bark, still tied, somehow, to those centuries of shared history. So ends our third story, the long companionship of animals and people through an age of faith, fear, and fascination. In the next tale, we'll travel into a different form of medieval entertainment, one not of beasts, but of beliefs. We'll meet the fortune tellers, charm makers, and dream readers who offered amusement and hope in a world ruled by fate. When the sun set over the crooked rooftops of a medieval town, the world seemed full of invisible powers. Candles flickered, shadows danced on stone walls, and the people, peasants and nobles alike, believed the air itself was alive with unseen meaning. The Middle Ages were an age of faith, but also of deep superstition. To believe in God was expected. To believe in signs, omens, and the turning of fate was simply natural. Every bird that flew at dawn, every dream before harvest, every flicker of candle flame might carry a message. And where there was belief, there were those who made it their work, and sometimes their amusement, to interpret it. They were the fortune tellers, charmers, and wise folk of medieval Europe. Neither priests nor outlaws, they existed in a grey space between faith and fear, guiding, deceiving, and entertaining those who sought to glimpse what lay ahead. The medieval appetite for mystery, daily life in the Middle Ages, was uncertain. A bad harvest could starve a village, a fever could take a family within days. War, taxes, famine, and disease moved like shadows through the land. It's no surprise that people searched for reassurance, something that made the unknown seem understandable. Fortune telling filled that need. But it wasn't always serious. For many, it was recreation, a small thrill in a world without modern amusements. To hear one's future, to imagine luck, love, or wealth waiting somewhere ahead, was a form of hope disguised as fun. And in a time when stories were shared more than read, the fortune teller's words became entertainment as much as prophecy. The marketplace seers imagine the marketplace on a spring morning. The air smells of fish, leather, and straw. Merchants shout their prices, children chase each other between stalls, and somewhere near the edge, just past the cloth seller's booth, stands a woman wrapped in a dark shawl. She calls out softly, palm readings, fortunes, and charms. See what the stars have written for you. People stop. Some laugh. Some glance around to be sure the parish priest isn't watching. For a small coin, she'll trace the lines of your hand, mumbling about the Mount of Venus and the River of Life. Perhaps she'll look into your eyes and speak of a journey before the next harvest, or a new love with hair the color of wheat. Whether it's true or not hardly matters. For a few minutes, a farmer, a maid, or a merchant's apprentice can imagine being the center of fate's design. And when they walk away, smiling shyly, the seer collects her coins and moves to the next customer. This was the rhythm of small-town fortune-telling, half performance, half prayer. The language of the stars, astrology, was the most respected form of divination. In medieval Europe, it wasn't just tolerated, it was studied. To the educated, the stars were seen as part of God's grand clockwork. They didn't contradict faith, they revealed its timing. Monks in abbeys drew elaborate star charts, tracking the movements of Mars and Saturn with mathematical precision. Astrologers advised kings on when to wage war, when to marry, and even when to conceive heirs. The 12 zodiac signs, borrowed from ancient Greek and Arabic texts, became a familiar language. To be born under Aries or Libra was to have a destiny shaped by cosmic balance or aggression. Of course, most peasants couldn't read a horoscope, but they understood the idea. If a storm came under a certain moon, they said, it meant poor crops. If a child was born during a solar eclipse, it was thought to have special fate, blessed or cursed, depending on who you asked. Even medicine followed the stars. Doctors scheduled bloodletting and surgery according to astrological charts. It wasn't seen as mystical, just careful. So when a street astrologer cast his charts for coins, he was performing both entertainment and science, in a world that didn't draw a clear line between the two. A candle magic and fortune by firelight. For those who couldn't afford astrologers, simpler methods offered comfort. One popular pastime was ceromancy, divination by candle wax. You'd melt wax and pour it into cold water, watching the shapes that formed. A heart meant love, a ring meant marriage, a broken circle meant misfortune. Young women did this most often, especially during festivals or midsummer nights. They'd gather in small groups, whispering and laughing, interpreting each other's fortunes by firelight. Sometimes they used mirrors, watching the reflections for visions of their future husbands. Others listened to the sound of the wind or counted the sparks from the hearth. It was, in many ways, a medieval form of party entertainment, part ritual, part game, filled with nervous giggles and candle smoke. Priests disapproved, of course, but they rarely interfered unless the games grew too serious. The line between innocent curiosity and forbidden magic was thin, and always shifting. The signs in nature, in villages surrounded by forest and field. Nature itself became the great oracle. The cry of an owl near a house was a bad omen. A spider spinning near the fire meant a guest was coming. If a dog howled at night, someone nearby was dying. People learned to read the world the way we read weather reports. Bird flight, animal behavior, the shapes of clouds. All were thought to carry messages from the divine. The idea wasn't foreign to the church. After all, in the Bible, dreams and signs often carried God's will. The difference was who interpreted them. When a priest read a sign, it was called prophecy. When a peasant did, it was superstition. Still, the practice persisted. It was a kind of comfort to believe that nothing was random, that even a blackbird's cry had meaning. And perhaps, on long, uncertain nights, that belief made the darkness feel just a little safer. The cunning folk in every region. There were those who claimed special knowledge, part healer, part sorcerer, part entertainer. They were known by many names: wise women, cunning men, charmers, or simply the knowing ones. They could cure headaches, bless fields, or reveal a thief. They might also read fortunes, cast love charms, or sell amulets made of bone and herbs. The church often tolerated them, so long as they didn't claim power greater than God's. But when misfortune struck, when a cow died, a baby sickened, or a storm ruined the crops, suspicion quickly turned against them. Still, the demand for their skills never disappeared. One record from 14th century Norfolk describes a wise woman named Alice who told fortunes using a mirror and a bowl of water. Another, from France, speaks of a village scribe who cast lots to tell farmers when to plant their seeds. For every accusation of witchcraft, there were hundreds of quiet consultations, whispered exchanges in kitchens and cottages, trading silver pennies for a few words of fate. It was both survival and showmanship. Festivals of fortune. Many of the great medieval festivals included fortune games. On Midsummer's Eve, when bonfires burned high and young people danced in the fields, girls would gather herbs said to reveal their future husbands. One custom had them place yarrow under their pillows and whisper, "Thou pretty herb of Venus tree, thy true name it is yarrow. Now who my bosom friend must be, pray tell thou me tomorrow." If they dreamed of a face, that was their fate. At Candlemas, people melted wax and predicted the year's prosperity from the way it burned. At All Hallows' Eve, the boundaries between worlds were thought to thin, a perfect time for fortunes and pranks. Even Christmas had its superstitions. It was said that animals spoke at midnight, and that dreams during the 12 days of Christmas foretold the next 12 months. These customs were not condemned, they were woven into celebration. Divination had become, quite literally, holiday fun. Of the curious role of the clergy, not all priests despised fortune-telling. Some participated quietly under the veil of scholarship. Astrology and dream interpretation had deep roots in early Christian philosophy. Saint Augustine himself warned against false divination but admitted that heavenly bodies might influence earthly life. In monasteries, monks compiled dream books, guides to interpreting visions. A dream of gold meant success, of teeth falling out death, of climbing a tower, spiritual growth. These books were copied and passed through Europe, both in Latin and in vernacular languages. They were read for comfort and, occasionally, amusement. To sit by candlelight and ponder one's dream was not always heresy, it was an evening pastime. Between faith and folly, it's easy now to smile at these beliefs, but in their time, they made sense. A world without electricity, medicine, or meteorology was a world of mystery, and people filled that mystery with meaning. When you think of a medieval fortune teller, don't imagine a cackling witch by a bubbling cauldron. Imagine instead an old woman by a hearth, turning cards made from scraps of parchment, a scholar in his study tracing the stars, a group of friends laughing as melted wax formed strange shapes in a bowl. These were the small amusements of a world without certainty, and they provided what all games, stories, and superstitions do, a way to pass the time, to dream a little, and to make sense of a universe that often felt vast and indifferent. Yet, as harmless as many of these customs seemed, others crossed invisible boundaries, into rituals, charms, and darker forms of belief that the church could not ignore. And soon, in the next part of this tale, those playful games of destiny would turn into accusations of heresy and witchcraft. The medieval appetite for mystery had always existed alongside fear. For every villager who sought comfort from a charm or a whispered prophecy, there was another who watched with suspicion. It was one thing to play at fortune, telling for fun, and quite another to claim power over fate. In the flickering half-light of the late Middle Ages, that distinction began to fade. What had once been harmless curiosity, the games of wax, dreams, and stars, started to draw the attention of men who feared what they could not explain. And so, the same fortune tellers who once entertained townsfolk found themselves standing before bishops and judges, accused of far darker things. The turning of the tide by the 13th and 14th centuries, the church's attitude towards superstition had hardened. Where earlier theologians might have tolerated astrology or harmless charms, the rise of heresy trials changed everything. Europe was becoming anxious, spiritually, socially, and politically. The Black Death, the 100 Years' War, and repeated famines had left deep scars. Every misfortune seemed to demand an explanation. The world, they thought, could not simply be chaotic. If it wasn't God's doing, it must be the devil's. So when a wise woman cured an illness, or a cunning man found a lost ring through mystical means, people began to wonder, by whose power did they act? The Church's answer was clear. If not divine, then diabolical. The Church's view of magic. Medieval theologians divided magic into two kinds: natural magic, which used herbs, minerals, and stars, things created by God; demonic magic, which called upon spirits or invoked hidden powers. In theory, a healer who used herbs blessed by prayer might be tolerated. But if she claimed to speak with spirits, or if her cures involved secret words, she risked accusation. The difficulty, of course, was that the boundary between natural and demonic was invisible. A woman muttering charms over an injured cow might be praying, or she might be summoning forces best left unnamed. Suspicion depended less on what she did, and more on who watched her do it. The case of Alice Kyteler, one of the earliest famous witchcraft trials in Europe, was that of Alice Kyteler. In Kilkenny, Ireland in 1324, Alice was no poor peasant woman. She was a wealthy innkeeper, well-connected and intelligent, but she also had a reputation for fortune telling and love charms, things whispered about, not spoken of openly. When her fourth husband died mysteriously, her stepchildren accused her of witchcraft. They claimed she had bewitched him with potions, sacrificed animals, and renounced Christ in favor of the devil. Under Bishop Richard de Ledrede, the case became sensational. Alice fled before her trial could begin, but her servant, Petronilla de Myth, was tortured and burned at the stake. In truth, the accusations read like superstition mixed with gossip. Love charms, powders, whispered prayers. But in that anxious age, such acts were no longer mere entertainment. They were evidence of alliance with the infernal. Alice Kyteler disappeared from history, perhaps escaping to England, but her trial marked a turning point, the moment when playful fortune telling became officially dangerous. Astrology under suspicion, even astrology, once the darling of scholars, began to fall under scrutiny. During the 14th century, as the papacy grew wary of anything resembling divination, astrologers found themselves accused of predicting not just destinies, but the future of kingdoms and popes. In 1326, Pope John II issued a bull condemning magicians and diviners who used the stars to foretell human affairs. He believed such acts infringed upon divine will. Yet, paradoxically, even as the Church condemned astrology, it continued to use it in quieter ways. Court physicians consulted the stars before performing surgery. Architects aligned cathedrals according to celestial patterns. It was a contradiction that defined the age. Suspicion and dependence, fear and fascination, living side by side. The women in the shadows' most fortune tellers were women. That fact alone shaped how they were treated. In a society where literacy and authority belonged largely to men, women who spoke with confidence, especially about matters unseen, seemed threatening. A woman could not preach, but she could whisper prophecies. She could not lead soldiers, but she could read omens. Her power was informal, social, and therefore unpredictable. Villagers might laugh with her in the marketplace, but when things went wrong, when crops failed or infants died, those same people remembered her strange words. The fortune teller's charm became a curse. Her little games became evidence. In trial records, her tools are often listed as proof of guilt: a mirror, a string of beads, a bundle of herbs, a carved figure of wood. To us, they seem harmless. To her accusers, they were instruments of sorcery. The fear of the familiar, the Inquisitors' manuals of the 15th century, books like the Malleus Maleficarums, the Hammer of Witches, blurred the line between superstition and witchcraft entirely. What had once been amusement now became heresy. Dream interpretation, love charms, and even palm reading were condemned as pacts with the devil. The reasoning was chillingly simple. If such acts seemed to work, then God could not have willed it. Therefore, they must involve dark powers. This logic trapped countless ordinary people. A woman who guessed the weather, a man who read the stars, a midwife who murmured a prayer for a safe birth, all could be accused. Most were never formally tried, but suspicion lingered. It changed how people spoke, how they played, and how they sought fun. Even fortune telling for amusement had to move underground, whispered during holidays, disguised as jokes, or cloaked in religion. The quiet persistence of play still, people continued. In England, by the late 15th century, printed pamphlets began to circulate, small, cheaply made booklets offering dream meanings, the 12 houses of destiny, and signs of the moon. They were sold not as magic, but as curiosity. A farmer might buy one out of amusement, reading aloud by the fire. If you dream of losing teeth, expect sorrow. If you dream of water, prepare for a journey. It was entertainment disguised as education. Even noble courts indulged. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, famously employed astrologers, including the mysterious Nostradamus. He was both spectacle and comfort, part scientist, part performer. The fear of witchcraft had not erased the hunger for wonder. It had only made it more cautious, more secret. The village games return among the peasantry. Fortune games survived through disguise. Midsummer wax readings became marriage games. Dream interpretations were turned into verses or songs. Herbal charms were blessed in the name of saints. A charm for luck might begin with the words, Saint Brigid, keep this home in peace, as stars above in order move. Or was it superstition or prayer? No one could say for sure. The medieval world learned to wrap its mysteries in the language of faith. Even priests looked the other way, so long as no one spoke of devils or demanded too much attention. And the theatre of confession, one of the strangest outcomes of this fear was that confession itself became a kind of performance. Penitents would kneel and confess not only sins but dreams, omens, and curious experiments. Some confessed to visiting fortune tellers, others to being one. Priests, overwhelmed by the sheer variety of these stories, began to keep lists, questions to ask during confession. Hast thou sought counsel of diviners? Hast thou cast lots or consulted the stars? Hast thou believed in signs more than scripture? These lists survive in manuscripts, revealing just how widespread such practices were. Everyone, it seemed, had dabbled for curiosity, for hope, or simply for fun. It was not rebellion. It was human nature, the need to know what tomorrow might bring. Between punishment and fascination, the paradox of the Middle Ages is that fortune telling was both condemned and cherished. It was illegal to divine the future, yet nobles hired astrologers. It was sinful to read omens, yet kings demanded them before battle. It was dangerous to practice magic, yet everyone owned a charm. The truth is, Europe never stopped believing in signs. It simply learned to pretend otherwise. Beneath the surface of sermons and decrees, the quiet games continued. In kitchens, barns, and back rooms, where laughter met fear and the flicker of a candle was enough to turn curiosity into courage. The first sparks of the witch trials by the 15th century, this simmering tension would ignite into something far darker, the great witch persecutions of early modern Europe. But even before that storm, the seeds were sown in these smaller stories, of cunning folk and wandering seers who entertained one day and were accused the next. Their fates varied. Some disappeared quietly. Others were remembered in whispers, as saints, sinners, or tricksters. What they all shared was a peculiar kind of bravery to speak of destiny in a world terrified of it. As the medieval centuries waned, the role of the fortune teller began to shift again, from hunted heretic to tolerated eccentric. And with the dawn of the Renaissance, curiosity, once condemned, would re-emerge under a new name, science. But before that awakening, there was still one last chapter in the story, when divination became theatre once again, not in fear, but in fascination. When the 15th century melted into the 16th, something remarkable happened across Europe. The fear that had once burned witches and silenced wise women began slowly to loosen its grip. It wasn't that superstition disappeared, far from it. Rather, it began to transform. As the Renaissance dawned, the old medieval world, with its flickering torches and whispered omens, made way for candlelit salons, printed almanacs, and scholars who saw the stars not as demons' tools, but as celestial mathematics. Fortune-telling, once a dangerous game of faith and fear, became again what had been centuries before, a form of entertainment, of curiosity, and of comfort. From sin to science, the Renaissance loved patterns. To the thinkers of Florence, Paris, and London, the universe itself was a grand design, orderly, mathematical, and filled with secret correspondences. Astrology, once banned, found itself dressed in new clothing, the language of natural philosophy. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola argued that studying the stars wasn't sorcery, it was divine contemplation. God, they said, had written his will into the heavens. To read it was not rebellion, but reverence. And so, while theologians still frowned, artists, physicians, and even popes quietly turned to astrologers again. In this new age, the astrologer was not a beggar by the marketplace, but a learned man with books and instruments. a thinker who might also draw your birth chart while discussing Plato. The courts of stars, kings, and queens adored their astrologers. In France, Catherine de' Medici, queen, regent, and matriarch, consulted her astrologer Michel de Nostradame, better known as Nostradamus. He wasn't merely a prophet but a performer, writing his cryptic verses in elegant French that left room for imagination. His predictions entertained as much as they warned. At court gatherings, guests whispered over his rhymed quatrains, finding themselves, or their rivals, hidden in the lines. Whether or not they believed him hardly mattered. It was fashionable to wonder. In England, Queen Elizabeth I kept her own astrologer, John Dee, a scholar fluent in Latin, mathematics, and the occult. He advised her on the timing of her coronation, using celestial charts. He was respected as both magician and mathematician, the two roles no longer in conflict. The fortune teller, once a figure of ridicule or fear, had become a kind of intellectual entertainer, a man of mystery invited to dine with royalty. The printed prophecies, meanwhile, among ordinary people. Fortune-telling was becoming something entirely new, a commodity. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, made cheap books and pamphlets available to anyone who could afford a few coins. Among them were almanacs filled with star charts, weather predictions, and mysteries of fortune. They were part calendar, part entertainment. Each year brought new editions, lucky and unlucky days for all labors, dreams and their meanings, the signs of the moon and the fate of kings. People read them aloud in taverns and kitchens, laughing, guessing and comparing their fortunes. It was a safe, socially acceptable way to play with fate, under the respectable guise of literacy. In a world still uncertain, with plagues and wars not yet banished, it was comforting to believe that the coming year might be foretold in ink. Parlor games of fate. As the Renaissance spread, fortune-telling drifted back into the realm of games, polite amusements for long winter evenings. In Italy, young women began using cards for fortune-telling. What had started as a simple deck for gaming evolved into a new kind of play, cartomancy. The earliest tarot cards weren't mystical at first. They were beautifully painted images for aristocratic leisure. But over time, their symbols, the fool, the wheel, the star, began to take on meanings beyond the game. By the 16th century, fortune-telling with cards was common in homes from Venice to Paris. A hostess might invite guests to draw a card, for fun, pretending not to take the result too seriously, and yet everyone leaned in a little closer to see what fate might reveal. It was a transformation of tone more than belief. The same curiosity that once sent peasants to wise women now found its place beside fine tapestries and silver goblets. Palmistry and personal fate. Palmistry also enjoyed a revival. The art of reading hands, tracing the mounts, and lines, said to reveal character, was reintroduced to Europe from Arabic and Indian traditions. Scholars like Paracelsus and Johannes Indagen wrote treatises on the subject, blending it with anatomy and philosophy. They argued that the hand was a map of the soul, created by divine design, and so, in the candlelit chambers of the learned, what had once been a peasant's trick became a subject of debate. A visiting scholar might examine another's palm not as a sin, but as an exercise in understanding human nature. The future, it seemed, was no longer forbidden knowledge, merely unproven science. The cunning folk survive. In the countryside, however, life changed little. The cunning folk, the healers, charmers and small-town fortune-tellers, continued as before, reading dreams and curing headaches. But now, instead of being hunted, they were often quietly respected. Villagers might consult both priest and wise woman, depending on the need. A charm might be blessed with a prayer to Saint Bridget and a pinch of salt. A fortune might be read, jest, but taken to heart nonetheless. The difference was tone. Superstition was no longer rebellion, it was tradition, a way to keep one's world ordered. And so, the medieval fascination with fate lived on, mellowed and domesticated, finding its place between religion and reason. The Renaissance mind and its mirrors. What made the Renaissance different from the Middle Ages was not what people believed, but how they approached belief. The medieval world had feared the unknown. The Renaissance sought to understand it, to catalogue it, diagram it, and give it meaning. Magic and science blurred into each other. Astrology became astronomy, alchemy became chemistry, dream interpretation became psychology. Even the church, though cautious, began to accept that knowledge itself could glorify God. That curiosity was not always temptation. The fortune-teller's mirror became, in time, the scholar's telescope. The candlelit room of mystery became the laboratory. And yet, in their essence, both acts were the same: the search for pattern in chaos. A world still haunted despite the rational spirit of the Renaissance. The old fears never truly vanished. In remote corners of Europe, witch trials still flared. Superstition clung stubbornly to rural life. But even there, the tone was changing. By the late 1500s, many trials ended in acquittal. Judges and scholars began to question the logic of confessions and spectral evidence. In a sense, the fortune teller had outlasted the witch hunter. The game of predicting fate, once a dangerous whisper, had become a harmless curiosity once again. From fortune to fashion, by the early 17th century, printed books on dream interpretation, astrology, and palmistry filled the shelves of city bookshops. They were marketed not as spells but as pastimes. Illustrated volumes taught readers how to discover their destiny through the stars, or find love through the lines of the hand. They sold not fear, but fascination. In aristocratic salons, guests compared horoscopes. In taverns, apprentices drew cards by firelight. In marketplaces, traveling seers still told fortunes for a coin, now without the need to glance over their shoulders. It was, in a sense, the final victory of curiosity over fear, the legacy of the medieval seers. The long history of medieval fortune telling reveals something deeply human: our need to believe that life has meaning, that somewhere, hidden in the pattern of stars or the curve of a palm, lies a story written just for us. For medieval people, those stories were both sacred and entertaining. They played with fate because it gave them comfort. They asked questions of the unseen because the world around them was uncertain. And in doing so, they built the foundations for our own fascination with the unknown, from horoscopes in newspapers to tarot cards on coffee tables. The same quiet desire endures to imagine that we might, somehow, glimpse the shape of what is to come. The gentle fade of an age as you picture the close of this story. Imagine a Renaissance parlor, a polished table, a single candle, and a group of guests laughing softly as a young woman draws a card. The card shows the wheel of fortune, a reminder that everything turns: kings and peasants, sin and science, fear and curiosity. Outside, the world hums with new ideas, but inside, the ancient rhythm continues, a flicker of wax, a whisper of prophecy, and the quiet thrill of wondering what tomorrow might bring. And so ends Story 4, where the fortune tellers of the Middle Ages walked the delicate line between faith and folly, only to become the philosophers of the Renaissance. Their world was full of fear, wonder, and play, and somehow that same mixture still hums in ours. Next, we turn from the mystical to the absurd, to a pastime that required no stars, mirrors, or prophecies, but plenty of mud and noise. Imagine, if you will, a winter's morning in a medieval city. The streets are glazed with frost, the sky pale with breath and smoke. It is early January, the time when the last scraps of Yule feasts have gone stale, when fields still sleep, and when, for a brief and glorious moment, the world decides to stop taking itself seriously. In towns across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, the bells that usually summon the faithful to solemn mass instead call them to merriment. The priests, the choir boys, even the bishop himself are part of a festival that has no equal, the Feast of Fools. This is not a carnival in the way you might imagine, no masked Venetians or royal parades. It is something far older, stranger, and far more chaotic. For on this day, the medieval world turned itself upside down. The origins of disorder. To understand the Feast of Fools, you have to remember how strictly ordered medieval life was. Every person had a place: noble, peasant, priest, beggar, and stepping outside of it could be dangerous. The church set the rhythm of the year with feasts, fasts, and saints' days. It governed behavior, belief, even laughter. But human beings, as always, found ways to let off steam. In the monasteries of the 10th and 11th centuries, when monks spent long days in silence and prayer, a curious custom appeared: the Feast of the Subdeacons. On this day, usually near the New Year or Epiphany, the junior clergy took charge. They parodied the higher officials, dressed in absurd costumes, and held mock ceremonies that bordered on blasphemy. They sang nonsense hymns, wore donkey ears or rags instead of vestments, and sometimes, quite literally, brayed in the church aisles. What had begun as a playful outlet for young clerics soon grew into one of the most bizarre and beloved spectacles of the Middle Ages. The Donkey's Mass, one of the most famous versions of the feast, was the Fête du Nez, the festival of the ass, celebrated in parts of France. It honored the donkey that, according to legend, carried the Holy Family into Egypt. During the ceremony, a real donkey was led into the church. Instead of solemn chants, the congregation sang verses in praise of the animal. At the end of the Mass, the The priest would turn toward the people and bray, "He, how," 3 times, and the congregation as one would bray in reply. There is something wonderfully absurd about it. Imagine the echoing stone nave filled with laughter, the flicker of candlelight glinting on the donkey's coat, the choir boys barely able to keep straight faces as incense smoke curls around the rafters. For a single morning, holiness and humor existed side by side, and no one seemed quite sure where one ended and the other began. A holy mockery, the Feast of Fools, spread widely across Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries. In some cathedrals, the lowest ranking cleric would be elected as Bishop of Fools. He would wear a mitre made of cheesecloth or paper, ride backwards on a donkey, and issue ridiculous dicks for the day. Everything about the sacred ritual was turned into a joke. Psalms were replaced with bawdy songs. The choir sang off key on purpose. Processions wound backward through the church. Incense was replaced by ashes or straw. Even the solemn act of reading scripture was parodied. One chronicler described how mock priests read from the Book of Gibberish, inventing nonsense Latin and causing the entire congregation to erupt in laughter. It sounds outrageous, and it was, but the purpose was not pure rebellion. In a world ruled by divine hierarchy, the Feast of Fools allowed a controlled explosion of disorder. For a single day, the tensions of daily obedience were released through laughter. By mocking the sacred, people renewed their respect for it. It was a ritual of release, not destruction. The church's dilemma, of course, not everyone approved. By the 13th century, bishops and theologians were deeply uneasy about the growing excesses of these celebrations. Some accounts describe drunken clerics dancing in the sanctuary, wearing masks, or even staging mock marriages inside churches. The boundary between play and sacrilege grew dangerously thin. Reformers like Pope Innocent III condemned the festivals, calling them shameful abuses. Councils and synods across Europe issued bans: no more donkey braying, no more mock bishops, no more feasts of fools. And yet, the festivals refused to die. In city after city, even when officially forbidden, they continued, sometimes in secret, sometimes in full view of everyone. It seemed that people needed this annual reversal too much to give it up. As one medieval scholar wrote, "The world cannot bear to be serious all year long." The spirit of misrule, the Feast of Fools, was only one example of a broader tradition of misrule. Throughout Europe, communities staged their own moments of sanctioned chaos. In England, the Lord of Misrule presided over Christmas reveries. In France, the Prince des Sots, Prince of Fools, led parades of mock clergy and peasants. In the Low Countries, guilds of rabauds, rascals roamed the streets in costume, singing rude songs and mocking the powerful. During these days, servants dressed as masters, beggars as bishops, and women as men. The natural order was not destroyed, only inverted. For a moment, laughter became a form of equality. The poor could mock the rich, the young could tease the old, and no punishment would follow when the festival ended. It was a social safety valve, disguised as comedy. The cathedral square, picture now a great cathedral square at twilight, say in Chartres or Rouen. The snow is packed hard underfoot, and a bonfire burns in the center. Vendors sell spiced wine and roasted chestnuts. A choir of young clerics, red-faced and mischievous, sing an off-key hymn about the Bishop of Fools. Behind them, a man in a donkey mask waves a censer full of straw smoke. Children shriek with laughter. The bells ring not solemnly but joyfully, as if even the stone towers are in on the joke. At the edges, older townsfolk watch with amusement and a touch of disapproval. They know the festival will end at sundown, that tomorrow order will return and penance will be said. But for now, the city belongs to laughter. The quiet meaning behind the noise. It might all sound like mindless revelry, but underneath the laughter, something profound was happening. The Feast of Fools revealed a truth about medieval life, that even in a world ruled by God and kings, people needed moments of imperfection. They needed to laugh at what frightened them, to parody what ruled them, to feel, for a few hours, that the universe was not as rigid as it seemed. Modern historians often see the Feast of Fools as a kind of collective therapy. It was a ritual inversion that made daily obedience bearable. And when dawn came again, and the bells rang solemnly once more, people returned to their duties not resentful, but refreshed. The laughter had done its work. The echo of laughter by the late 15th century, the church's patience finally wore thin. The Feast of Fools was banned in most cathedrals, its laughter declared indecent. But its spirit lived on. It transformed into the carnival, the great pre-Lenten festival that swept through Europe with masks, dances, and parades. The sacred parody became civic celebration. The donkey was replaced by floats, the bishop of fools by jesters and masked kings. And so, even as the feast of fools vanished from the cathedrals, its laughter spilled into the streets. The world would continue to turn itself upside down, only now it did so outside the church walls. As the last embers of the bonfire fade, the laughter dies into the cold night. Somewhere a priest sighs in relief, knowing that tomorrow the prayers will sound pure again. Yet even he smiles a little.